service to Sudbury. We look forward to learning about the achievements of Florence Hosmer. Helen Marie Casey.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lee. It's a pleasure to be here and to see so many of you here to share your afternoon with me. I'm deeply honored. Thank you for coming. And thanks to Peg Fredrickson, who's in the booth and taking care of cable casting this for us, for inviting me to speak. She invited me to speak about the Puritans, and I declined. I said I'd done that once for the Society, and that I really thought it was a nice opportunity to learn something new and be able to share it. And I thought, you know, I don't know much about Florence Hosmer. I'll bet there are folks in town who didn't know her and don't know very much about her, and it will be fun to do the work and then to be able to share it. And so not only am I eager to share what I've learned, but I can hardly wait to hear your insights. Those of you who knew Florence, those of you who had friends who knew Florence, some of you who own art that Florence created. So thank you to Peg for inviting me. Thank you to Lee for all of his help when I wanted to do archival research, and he was most encouraging. And also from the Sudbury Historical Commission, in particular, thank you to Lynn and to, where's my friend Mr. Balco, who were so many hours with me in the Hosmer house, sometimes when it was very cold, and I'm sure they had many other things to do, so thank you to both of you. It meant so much to be encouraged to do the work, and along the way, all sorts of folks encouraged me. June and Clay Allen did, Wynne Fitzgerald did, and so it's a special pleasure to have this Sudbury work to share. Now, I'm going to move backward in time, forward in time, and I want you to know something about my method. I determined that I was not going to repeat to you hearsay, that what I'm going to offer to you will be only what I have seen from the correspondence, from the diaries, from the journals, with my own eyes. I will offer you my observations and my insights. And what I want you to know is, right now, it's a partial story. There are drawers of materials yet to be gone through, so we might well meet again sometime and have chapter 2 of this. So I'd like to call this Finding Florence Hosmer. And I find it not only a matter of searching for Florence, but searching for Sudbury in a time that is now past. So first, some observations, and then we begin with the story itself. Our lives consist of puzzle pieces. When we are gone, the pieces of our life scatter. Someone else tries to put the picture back together again. It will always be incomplete. Pieces will have gone missing. Some will be faded and torn, difficult to decipher, the way old photographs often are, and we wish someone had written down what the significance is, but there's no marking on the photograph. Sometimes more than one picture can be assembled, and we do our best to retrieve what the French call le temps perdu, time that is past, that is gone, that is lost. Nowadays, when you see biographies, you often see that the title says, A Life, because we've come to conclude we can't know the life, and also that there may be more than one life. Depending upon who knew you, the life looks different. So let's begin with Florence. Florence Hosmer, American artist, was born on October 20th, 1880, in Woodstock, Connecticut, not here in Sudbury, Massachusetts. It wasn't so many years since the Civil War had ended. There was agitation for women to gain the right to vote. It would take some time before we gained that right. The world of art was in upheaval. Women were breaking barriers in studios and exhibition halls in America and in Europe. Let me share some of the names of people who were contemporaries of Florence Hosmer. Mary Cassatt, Camille Claudel, Berthe Morisot, Frida Kahlo, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Alice Neal. Interesting mélange of people as you think of their productions and set them side by side with Florence's. And afterwards, when you go across the street and look at the images, you might have in mind how differently people approached the art of portraiture. Let us commence, as so many stories do, with a dramatic event. In 1897, the Hosmer family suffered the kind of loss from which some families never recover. Lightning struck their Connecticut home and burned it to the ground. In later years, Florence told of her older brother Albert picking her up and taking her outside. She said that lightning struck the very place where she had been lying. Whether she actually said, "I was saved by the Lord," or whether that was attributed to her, is a matter of speculation. It was Albert, the oldest son, the son with a remarkable baritone voice, who is credited with finding the Sudbury home right across the street. It was he who signed the Memorandum of Agreement for the house at the corner of Concord Road and Old Sudbury Road. He offered to buy 9 acres more or less, which we don't do anymore, and all that was in the buildings, including all the hay in the barn. That was specified. It was Mother and Father Hosmer, Edwin B. and Abby L., who paid widow Ella Willis from Willis Road here in Sudbury $2,000 cash in September of 1897. Now, they didn't have $2,000 in cash, and so they went to the bank. They went to the Middlesex Institution for Savings and borrowed $1,200. And they paid it back in $20 increments until in the year 1909, they had paid back the loan and owned the house. Today, part of what was the Hosmer property is our Heritage Park, because the 9 acres extended beyond the back. I want to describe what the family was like before I move into what Florence was like. Before lightning struck the Woodstock home, Edwin led the life of a typical 19th century farmer. He did hard manual labor from early in the morning until sundown. Here are entries from his diary in 1877. And some of you may have ancestors who recorded the same kinds of facts. January 4th, 1877, killed and dressed 3 sheep. Less than a week later, this morning, killed 2 sheep. January 22nd, have been butchering. Killed and dressed 4 sheep. He tells us, this day has been fearfully cold. He speaks of cutting apple trees, winnowing beans, papering and painting a new room in the house, cutting wood all day. He sold butter and vegetables. No doubt Abby made the butter and helped garden. She also cared for the children, of course, and tended to the daily affairs of the house. He wrote a month later, on February the 17th, Abby and I rode up to Father's this morning, bought a cow, a large thoroughbred Durham. We think she is a nice cow. Life was filled with hard work from sunup to sundown, and there was church life. Numerous entries that said, we attended church all of us, all day. Now, let us lift higher the lid to the past and move from Connecticut to Sudbury, Massachusetts. Moving forward in time to 1897, we see a teenaged girl with two older brothers, Albert, who was called Bert, and Winfred, who was called Fred, who loved to write verse and share it, a man after my own heart. In the first decade of the 20th century, Fred traveled as far as Moscow and St. Petersburg, Russia. He climbed a glacier and wrote 8-page letters home to his mother, sharing his excitement about his journey. The older sister in the family is named Alice, and I feel quite partial to Alice. She was a reader who constantly was borrowing books from the library. She speaks in her diary of baking as many as 15 pies in the morning before she baked bread and cleaned in the house. All of the children had an artist's temperament. The father, when he moves to Sudbury, is 57 years old. The mother, Abby Arms Hosmer, is 5 years younger. The 1880 census identified her, as it did so many women of the period, as simply keeping house. When Florence moved into the Sudbury house, the house was already almost 100 years old. Florence knew, even before she moved into the house, that she wanted to be an artist. Formal training lay ahead of her, but as early as 1894, when she was 14 years old, she was already signing her artwork and dating it, occasionally writing on the back of it how long it had taken her to produce the work that she produced. She was methodical and she was disciplined. By 1896, the young artist was evidencing the kind of talent that would eventually allow her to make her way as a professional artist. In that year, she received a necklace from a friend who had gone to Florence, Italy, and she created a work of art called To Florence, From Florence. She's wearing the necklace, and it shows quite a good likeness and quite a vitality which characterizes the best of her work, and you'll see it when we go across the street. Now, after they arrived in Sudbury, they became an integral part of the town, all of them. And I want to read just a portion of from some of the records that are upstairs here. On May the 16th, 1900, in Sudbury, Father E. Hosmer and his son, Albert E. Hosmer, were admitted as members of the Goodman Improvement Society of Sudbury Center, where we are sitting. A society meant to investigate and preserve the history and traditions of the town of Sudbury, to determine and properly mark historical sites, to set out and call for trees, shrubs, flowers in public places and around public buildings and railway stations, and increase the neatness and beauty of private homes and their surroundings. So they came to town, they took part in town, and through the next decades you'll find them having all sorts of assignments. Alice will be part of that committee. Eventually Florence will be in charge of the common out here and of keeping it tidy, but she's told not to spend too much money on it. Years later, in 1913, and I find this particularly charming, Alice is keeping a diary of every book she read. It's astounding to me that all these little tiny books in a tiny hand remain for us. Now I'm going to move us all the way up to 1960 to have a Sudbury old-timer reflect back on the period. And some of you may have known Marion Eaton. She was 90 years old in 1960, and Florence sent her a birthday card. And in thanks for that birthday card, the 90-year-old woman wrote this to Florence, thanking her for the remembrance. Your reference to Hosmer House awakened so many pleasant memories of the days when you and the family lived in the Hosmer house, you and your mother and brothers and sister. Later, when your brother and his wife lived there, and he conducted the choir. I often went to rehearsals held in your lovely studio, where 2 brisk fires were burning in the 2 fireplaces. And there were so many interesting things to see. I felt as though I had been transported to some enchanted spot. The home was a hive of activity when the Hosmers lived in it. Now, they had many subscriptions, and I think for Adolf and for Lynn, it is the bane of their existence. There are magazines and books and papers and newspapers and bags of archival materials in the house. But the treasure is this little book called My Book Record and Guide. From 1902 to 1919, Alice was recording every book, what it was about, who the author was, what she felt about the book. And there's a little epigraph in the book from John Morley, and it says, "The point is not that men, meaning all of us, should have a great many books, but that they should have the right ones, and that they should use those they have." So how could you not like Alice Hosmer? In the early 1900s, Alice described her students to Brother Bert in a letter that she sent him where he was teaching in Ohio. She said, "I have 49 students. I have music, drawing, geography, English, and all the extras like history and nature." Each of the Hosmer children, both the boys and the girls, had to earn their own way. Now, before we turn to Florence and her training as an artist, I want to share with you how she described her parents and their marriage. It was said my father, Edwin Barrett Hosmer, would probably have been a minister, as he had a fine Christian character and a gift for oratory. He often made speeches. But when he was a young man, he had a good deal of trouble with headaches, so he didn't become a minister. He had a fine bass voice, and with Mother's lovely alto, sang duets. They both sang in the choir. His father was a deacon in her father's church, who was the minister in Mason, New Hampshire. They were in the choir and came down to the front and were married one Sunday morning and went back to the choir and sang. It's very touching, isn't it? The community life of not so long a time ago. The Hosmer family had a strong devotion to each other, which I think is evident in the many portraits of family members on which Florence lavished her creative energy. Now, in 1899, in a book this size, and I took a tape measure with me as Lee and I were up in a cold room together, and I was doing research in boxes that Lee was bringing to the table for me. In 1899, in a small red blank book of a size to fit easily in a woman's palm, young Florence kept a record of her expenses. The cover of the book says, "Lister's Fertilizers." No doubt it was a freebie, the way we used to always get those Hallmark little books. No doubt it was given to her father, Edwin, as a bit of advertising for the Agricultural Chemicals Company. At this point, 1897, 1898, 1899, Florence is studying at Boston's Normal Art School. That's on the corner of Exeter and Newbury. She appears to be frugal, highly disciplined, and in the little book, she records her name in pencil and every nickel she spends. A nickel for lunch, a nickel for car fare, 2 cents for charcoal, 20 cents for a sketchbook. The fixatives for her artwork cost a nickel, cloth for an apron, 68 cents. She spends 81 cents on plaster. Every 3 months, and this is a mystery for me, she buys a ticket that costs $14.30. I don't know where she went. Her little book keeps the secret of where her ticket took her. That was a lot of money then, and it may be, we'll find out, because I think at the end of this, there will be information you have to share with me. At the end of her 4 years of art studies, Florence buys a new suit. She spends $15 for it. Maybe it's the yellow suit in the portrait that she paints of herself. Don't know. But perhaps, and it's more likely, it was to interview for a job as a teacher. She taught here in Sudbury, she taught in Wayland, she taught at the Danforth School, and all these many years later we still have her record book called The Improved School Record Book of 1913 to 1915. As late as 1925, what do you suppose she earned for a year of teaching? Not very much, $292.50 in 1925. We know that following art school, Florence gave a talk and she called it How to Enjoy Pictures. And we know that she gave the talk because she saved her notes. She quoted Emerson, and I love this. She said, "Every genuine work of art has as much excuse for being as the sun and the moon." Isn't that a grand act of faith? It's why I like the Hosmers. Florence's commitment to art is total. I don't think it ever occurred to her that anybody might disagree with her high estimate of art. At the normal school, which would become the Massachusetts College of Art, she studied Egyptian, Greek, and Renaissance sculpture. In 1901 and 1902, she studied artistic anatomy with Mr. Munsell. On November 4th, she noted that a knowledge of structure is a necessity to the figure painter. And then on the second page of her notes, she said, knowledge and sentiment, both are essential to express oneself intelligently in drawing. And she went on, drawing is a language that can be expressed in 3 ways: form, line, color. And she added, the human figure is the highest expression. So we know exactly where she came down. In her adulthood, we know that Miss Hosmer, who never married, was active and was a charter member of the Sudbury Women's Club. We know in 1920, the year that women in America could finally legally vote, she registered to vote. We know she was a professional artist who maintained studios in Boston at Trinity Court in the 1930s, and during World War II, she lived and painted at Studio 10 at 247 Newbury Street in Boston. For many years, she was director of the John Singer Sargent Studios in Boston. She was able to sell her art, some of it for a very good price. That she followed her heart and lived as an artist is one of her primary achievements, but not the only one. I want to now share some of the tributes that came to Florence from people who bought her art. In December of, and I want to add maybe an acknowledgement right here. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could find the other half? What I have been reading are letters sent to Florence, but I don't have any letters that Florence wrote. They're all what she received and kept. And somewhere in Sudbury, I suspect, there is a file of letters that Florence wrote. So some may come back to the Hosmer house. That's a little ad. In December of 1943, a friend named Dorothy sent a postcard to Florence on which she wrote, "I saw a lovely reproduction of your picture of the Seltenberg Quintet among the Upham's Christmas cards in East Woodstock," which means she was enterprising enough to reproduce her art on greeting cards, to make something more. It must be a beautiful painting. And the painting is a lovely depiction. There are 4 girls in gossamer white gowns, 4 sisters, and then in the foreground the brother, who's a flautist. It very much has the sense of Grecian nymphs who are dancing to music. It's got a magical warmth and grace to it, and clearly of another period, a period before ours, which is much harsher, I think, in its art often. Her brother Fred, a man who loved to play with verse, especially when he wrote to Florence or wrote about Florence, wrote this as a present for her when she turned 50. And I like to think it encapsulates who she was. "With you, all futures mean a song, a dance, a greater space, mid dazzling sunlight rays, where life is filled with beauty and romance." And so he was acknowledging the kind of vision that Florence had as she looked out at the world. This next segment I want to read to you evidences that she had a lively sense of humor. I don't know whether what it describes is true or not, but I tend to think it was. She must have been very mischievous. Now, the man writing this was an official of the United States. His name was Homer J. Brown, and he was writing to her in Boston, and he was the Commissioner of Conciliation. And she had painted a portrait of him, and he wrote a letter to her, part of it in rhyme, and I'm going to, with my voice, underscore the rhymes. And then you'll hear the vignette where she was being very naughty. And now I wonder if the cop we talked about ever came to your door, rang the bell to your studio, the one on the top floor. I can just see you now as he stands below outside in the slush, with your good right arm upraised and in your hand a small squash. As you are both brave and true, just as sure is your aim. Glad your missile is soft. To be hit with a hand, one might make him lame. As he wipes off his vest, the lions hear him exclaim, and that in no whisper, "What's this kind of a game? I'll go upstairs and find out who's to blame. I'll show her I know enough to come in out of the rain. For some of this storm has now gone to my brain. And about that time, sister, you'll wish you were on some train. Or maybe it would suit you better to be on a bus. For when policemen are mad, they surely can cuss. And the one you threw that squash at has started quite a fuss." Now, I don't know whether Flossie Hosmer threw a squash at a policeman. The signs certainly point in that direction. They confirm the interpretation of Miss Hosmer as entirely her own person. She comes alive as fun-loving and independent. But setting aside the fun, there's more in the letter. And it says it wasn't all fun and games for Florence Hosmer, that she had to spend a lot of time thinking about money. It's the middle of the Depression when this letter arrives, and Homer J. Brown is counseling Miss Hosmer to accept a lower sum of money for her art than she wants. So here's what he's telling her after the fun and games. In the event that young woman from the chorus or any other reasonable person from the church again takes up the matter of price, why not consider in all the circumstances $750 if you think you can afford it and ought to. Now, as I told you, I haven't said one word to anyone about price. And after all, you'll do what you think is right and best. I wish you could get $1,000. And If they do offer $7.50 and no sale takes place, it would just be too bad to hang it up at the studio there at Mount Ararat with none to admire it except you, the visitors, and the cat. With visitors, it would just be another picture about which you could chat. As for the cat, he'd sooner have a rat. Whereas, if the picture was sold, he's trying to wheedle and twist her around his hand, I think. Whereas, if the picture was sold, you could celebrate Christmas and have a turkey and plum pudding and cranberry sauce and all of that. Now, while she had her studio on Newbury Street, Florence completed portraits of prominent Salem figures. Here, too, price might have become an obstacle because she wasn't able to sell them. So she circulated a letter. In my judgment, she was very enterprising. She worked very hard to be able to market what she produced, and her descriptions are lovely. I have 3 paintings which might be suitable for the early American rooms. One is a portrait of Miss Huntington of Salem and Philadelphia, painted in her beautiful home on Chestnut Street in Salem. She was wearing a dress which was a family possession of plum satin and old lace. She was sitting in front of a secretary with a flame top and old brass oil lamps each side of the glass doors. Nearby is an old ladder-back chair and famous old prints on the walls. And then she goes on, and you have evidence of the painter's eye. Another is a portrait of Miss Anna Endicott of Chestnut Street, Salem. She was dressed in a heavy yellow satin from China, beautifully embroidered. On the wall is a portrait of an ancestor of Rayburn, once loaned to the art museum, also a picture of Governor Endicott. She is sitting on a high-backed chair with needlepoint embroidery. Beside her stands a nest of tables. Then she goes on to the 3rd portrait she has and wishes to sell. The 3rd is a portrait of Miss Belle Whipple, also of Salem. She is seated beside a fireplace, showing a McIntyre mantelpiece and an unusually lovely fire screen. Miss Whipple is wearing a green and white taffeta with old lace, a family treasure of striking beauty. But she didn't succeed in moving all of this art. Now, I don't think that those works are her best works. She was uneven, and so we still have some of those works. But there is the painting of Miss Charlotte Nichols in the Peabody Essex Nichols house. It was reproduced in the magazine Country Life. It was, with 5 of these Salem portraits, exhibited in Hamilton Hall on Chestnut Street in Salem in the 1920s. So she was respected. There were people in the war years who paid her a little bit of money at a time, $15, $15, $15, until finally they were able to pay. And you see many of the letters thanking her for her forbearance and letting them pay over time. And a woman who's sent her check for the final $15 adds this, and many of you will remember this period. She's talking about the 1940s. We have no sugar, have stopped using butter, can't buy apples worth having, no meat except chicken. Well, I'm not complaining, just summing up the things that make the end in view. And part of the charm of the collections in the Hosmer house is, as I repeat, that a period that is gone is encapsulated for us in letters, in postcards, in journals. In those war years, Florence had a number of sitters. A woman from Newton paid $200 once a year. And in 1942 she started, and in 1947 she paid the final $200 payment. Her name was Helen Bates, and she said, "Dear Florence, enclosed I am sending you my check for $200 in final payment for my husband's portrait. As I told you, we are delighted to have it, and everyone who sees it exclaims, 'What a wonderful likeness!' Thank you for waiting so patiently for your pay, which we realize is far below its value." So we know a couple of things. She was enterprising. She was willing to be patient. She made her way by being flexible, And she always had to worry about money, which is not unusual for artists, is it? She was a member, just by way of her credentials, she was a member of the Copley Society, the Cambridge Art Association, the Massachusetts Women's Club, the Boston Art Club. She exhibited at the Rochester Fair in 1908. She exhibited at the Boston Public Library. As late as 1948, when she would have been 68, Florence Arms Hosmer's Voltaire was being listed on the program of the Copley Society of Boston's members' annual exhibition. Her painting of the Honorable S.B. Pettingill is on exhibit in Grafton, Vermont. She had only an hour and a half with him to do this portrait, and yet he said if she had had a whole month, it couldn't have been better. My very favorite portrait, and it's the one that probably most of us know, is the portrait Yellow Suit, painted in 1921. I think it is a ravishing work. Sunlight kisses the curtains, and a golden hue inundates the work with joy. The black-brimmed belt and hat that the artist wears provides striking contrast to all the yellow and white hues that dominate the canvas. It has an ebullient mood about it, great sense of confidence. She is young, exuberant, irresistible. And I want to say a word now about this unevenness. Some people have said to me quite emphatically, well, you know, she wasn't very good. And I have this to say. She may not have been good all the time, but I have a particular point of view about art. Whether it's an artist who does visual work, or it's a poet, or it's a musician, if that artist does only one unforgettable work, I think that's enough. If you are ravished by a piece of work, that's sufficient. And I often find in buying a collection of poetry, if there's only one and it takes my breath away, that's enough. That's enough to warrant the cost. All right, let's move forward. I want to share an observation because we're dealing with a woman artist, and I want to read to you something that Virginia Woolf said in 1928, another artist, this one a verbal artist, of course. Money dignifies what is frivolous if not paid for. And I think that Florence understood that. If she had merely been doing this as leisure, it would not have been prized as it would be if you took it seriously enough to affix some price tag to it. Florence understood that price and value have long been conflated, and so she worked hard to build her reputation and to earn based on the merit of what she produced. She understood something else that Virginia Woolf understood and stated. It is much more important to be oneself than anything else. And I think that's, if we say that Florence's art and being faithful to it was one accomplishment, one achievement, so was that. Being true to herself, not being someone that someone else defined for her. I want now to flesh out a little bit vignettes again of the family before I pick up on Hosmer. This is just refreshing our mind. The house that Florence left to Sudbury, she left as a memorial to her father. So I want to be sure that we have the image of her father and her family members in mind. In 1893, as Alice is keeping a succession of diaries, she writes, and it reminds us of how easy it is for us these days when we can go to CVS and get aspirin if we don't feel well, or Tylenol. They couldn't do that, and so they're often suffering in the course of these diaries. It's 1893, and Alice writes, "Papa's bad. He could not go hay." A few weeks later in 1893, all of the apples were blown off our trees, and you think of the consequences for them. And then Florence, quite sick, and sometimes she writes, Florence's eyes bad. In 1894, Fred, Florence, and I went to circulating library. Big deal to go to the library. You don't just take it for granted that you can go and take out books. On the last day of 1894, Alice writes this, and I find it so touching. Excuse me a second. I am just where I want to be, but I would like some money to pay my board with and buy some warm underclothing. She had to walk to school in the winter, and it was cold. And it was a special thing when her dad could take her or come to pick her up and bring two horses, one for himself and one for her. And I think it's very leveling to go back and look again at that period. Years later, what was equally touching to me, Alice Hosmer in 1924 lay dying in the Hosmer house. She died at the age of 57. She was often unwell, and I think, oh, if only we had had the medicine to give to her. And her doctor, who was in Boston, every single day wrote to her to lift her spirits, and he put cartoons in the envelopes to bring a smile to her face. And he would say to her in these letters, you must take some nourishment and get well so that you can walk downstairs and watch your sister paint. And it's so touching. On Saturdays, he would drive out here to the country to check in on Alice. So there are so many stories about the house, which are stories about Sudbury and about the kindnesses of people. There are happy vignettes, there are sad vignettes, and I want to share one more of a time past that is a time for America, not just for Sudbury. And it's 1918, and the relatives in New Hampshire are writing, and this is what the uncle says to the children. People are beginning to realize that the dreadful war is over. This is the First World War. It has been terribly destructive to life and treasures in all the countries engaged in it, besides laying waste much of the country of France and others also. Some criticize our president quite sharply for leaving his home duties and going across the water. For one, I am glad he went, and am not surprised that he thought he ought to be in close touch with the great peace conference. I am satisfied he will do the American people credit. Now, let me trot through a couple more vignettes to our conclusion and then hear from you. During the Depression, again a touching vignette, Florence receives a dime back from New England Telephone and Telegraph. It's 1933, she had lost a dime, and it was that important that she asked for it back. It was the Depression. It reminds us of times past. Over the course of her life, Florence ran a tea shop. She took in boarders. Sometimes the boarders skipped out and didn't pay her. She outlived all of her immediate family, and eventually she couldn't take care of herself. So on the 28th day of May 1959, Florence Arms Hosmer signed an agreement with the inhabitants of the town of Sudbury to convey to the town her home, its contents as a memorial to her father, in exchange for suitable maintenance for the remainder of her life. She was then 79. She lived to be 97. And I love the fact that in her diary, as she ages, almost every day she writes, busy as usual. Now, isn't that a woman after our own heart? And as I come toward the end and the final days of her life, one more vignette. For 15 years, her dearest friend, Zoe Morse, lived in Hosmer House with her. Zoe was 7 years older than Florence and died at the age of 94. We should be such women. On her passport in 1920, when she traveled to Cuba, these were adventuring women, she described herself as an artisan. For more than 24 years, Zoe owned and managed a gift shop and a tea room called Treetops in Provincetown, Massachusetts, beginning at least as early as 1910. It was on Bradford Street and Kendall at the sign of the Yellow Windmill. It was open from July to October. When Zoe was in the hospital in the last year of her life, there is this poignant letter from Florence. Dear Zoe, I miss you. They had shared the fullness of these days in the end of their life. Dear Zoe, I miss you. Come back as soon as you can. I love you so much. Florence. In the final years of her life, Linda White cared for Florence and stayed nights with her. Florence had been gifted with talent, energy, a good family, and a wide circle of friends. She loved Sudbury, and Sudbury was good to her. Florence died in her home on February the 17th, 1978, leaving behind portraits, letters, journals, a home filled with possessions that keep the spirit of her family, her friends, and her time alive. She is buried in Wadsworth Cemetery. Friends of the Hosmer house tell me that this is what they hope from our little time chatting about her together. They hope that more people who know her story will stop to leave flowers at the graves of Florence, of Zoe, maybe of other members of the family, in the little cemetery not far from Goodnow Library. And so now I'd like to hear the things you know about Florence, your observations, your questions, and of course, we have so many people who've worked in the archives who know more than I do about Florence. Adolph and Lynn among them, Lee among them. So I welcome your questions, your observations, your insights. Patty?
That was wonderful. Should we give Helen a round of applause?
Thank you, Patty.
Well, I didn't mean to stir all that up. I do have a question about the mysterious letters that you said she had received letters. Do you know who she received them from? And
to go out and search.
Well, right. You were thinking the letters from her would be somewhere in Sudbury, but they might be.
Yes, correct.
So could you just tell us more of what you know about these mysterious letters?
First of all, thank you for that question. First of all, I was so impressed by how many letters there were because people used to write letters. And it made me sad that now we may not be leaving the same thing. We have email and we have telephones, and so we don't write in the same way. Every day, I think, there were people who used to write letters, many letters. And so a great many of hers were from the family. The family always checked in with each other, and if they couldn't take the time to write a long letter, they wrote postcards. And so grandmother and grandfather wrote, sisters and brothers wrote to each other, friends wrote to each other, but certainly the children of those relatives may have them. But there may be artists with whom, for example, Mabel Woodward, thank you, is a highly respected artist and was a friend of Florence, and there are some things from Mabel to Florence, and there may well be, if someone kept Mabel's correspondence, a number of letters, particularly about the art from Florence, if the word goes out and we let it be known. Also, since you asked about letters, it offers the opportunity for one more vignette. There is a huge stack of letters to Albert, for example, on his 21st birthday. Well, we forget that there was a time then that was when that was a kind of rite of passage, when a man turned 21. And so every relative, cousins, uncles, aunts, sisters, brothers, grandparents wrote to Bert. And they offered, many of them, Christian wisdom to him about how to lead his life. They talked about how important this was. But Father said, "Your mother tells me that today you turned 21. So he didn't necessarily remember that. But I think there are so many touching written documents because it was a different time from ours.
Thank you. I'm just curious, you told us that the Hosmer farm in Woodstock, Connecticut was struck by lightning, burned down. Why didn't they rebuild there or stay in Connecticut? What brought them to Sudbury?
Thank you. They did have a cousin in Concord, and they used to come up to visit, and I think they were looking for a property that they could afford to have and where the father could continue to farm. And so I imagine, I don't yet have a journal entry, but there are still so many journals I haven't gone through, and I do exactly hope for that. I hope for a description from Alice of what it was to lose all that they had worked so hard on and what it was to come here. But I haven't gotten to that stage yet.
Thank you. Very nice. Hosmer is a very well-known name in Watertown and in Acton, too, I think. Do you know what the connection is with the Hosmers from those places?
Thank you. There are many Hosmers, and there are other Hosmer houses. And she had a cousin, Harriet Hosmer, who was a sculptor who was considered quite a renegade, quite unladylike, because she lived as she wanted to live. And when she visited Robert Browning, even he was scandalized by her independence and free spirit. And apparently she was sufficiently wealthy to live as she liked. And there is in the Hosmer House archives a great deal now that we've discovered of tattered, torn where the creases are, genealogical data going all the way back. And now what we need to do, I think, is get some funding and get it transcribed so that we don't lose what we possess. And then we will know what all the linkages are. It would be my wish that maybe some found money would appear, and now that we see how much more remains to be done, we can get some help in doing it. I take every opportunity for ads. Other questions or comments or observations? Some of you may have known Florence and want to add something.
Yeah, I grew up down the farm on Hudson Road, and she used to call us on the phone and say, "Could you bring me up a pound of beans?" And I used to have to take them up on the bike, and Miss Morse and Flossie used to meet me at the door, and it'd be like 35 cents for a pound of beans. And
didn't you also send to her correspondence sometimes from camps and from military training?
No, I didn't know.
She apparently was very fond of many younger people in Sudbury, and there are postcards, but of course it's hard to know which Jim or which person, but little boys would write to her, and the postcards remain, and in pencil you can tell it's a child.
No,
writing.
I never did, but it was awful hard to get out of the house because you just talk forever, you know?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Ruth, here's the mic coming. I think they're cable casting this, and so you'll be heard.
It occurred to me that she invented the concept of the reverse mortgage, which is very popular now, in this notion that if she gave the town her house, she could stay there and be get some money, some maintenance. So she was an inventor as well as an artist. That was before the days of anybody thought of a reverse mortgage.
There was that, but you know, there were so many kindnesses. There were people, and I know Lee has spoken of this, who bought her canvases not because they loved art, but they wanted to help Florence in every way they could find to help her. And it was charming and touching to find how many people would stop by to take the ladies to lunch or to dinner. And I had forgotten about Cafe Stuga, but they would be taken there, and to the Wayside Inn and to the Colonial Inn, and how much it meant to them to have these services rendered to them. And so I think time and again there were kindnesses that perhaps aren't described, but they existed, and they are what made the life as comfortable as it was.
One of my early memories is sitting on the back stairs at Miss Hosmer's house, and it was for my aunt's recital. Bert was a music teacher and taught my aunt vocal singing. I think that my aunt thought that Flossie was a little harsh with Bert.
Oh!
Okay. Okay. That's all. It's just a little tidbit of...
Isn't that interesting? One does have the sense of Flossie becoming the primary figure somehow, maybe because she was the younger child. They certainly all did beautiful things for her, and Bert comes across as such a strong figure. And when he went away to Ohio to teach music and to direct choirs, he would send money back, and there's a letter where the mother is writing and saying, "Oh, Bert, now we can actually heat many rooms at once. This house, which used to be so cold, is warm and toasty in the front room and in the parlor at the same time." I think Mary Jane Hillary had a question, Lee, in the second row.
Hi, Mary Jane Hillary. I just wanted to comment, Helen Marie, that at one point I did do a story and interview on Florence Hosmer for the Sudbury Citizen with a photo. And if somebody has the patience to go through the Sudbury Citizens that I recently gave to the Historic Society, they'll probably come across it.
That would be very nice. Did you hold a particular image in mind, an impression?
No, I can't say that. She certainly was very open and happily willing to talk about herself, went into some of her history, and of course her main thrust was her artwork. And I guess she wanted it to be known that she was indeed an artist and that this was her vocation.
I think she fervently believed it was a calling. It was not something arbitrary in her mind.
I'm only sorry that I'm the one who took the picture against the light when I didn't have the advantage of having my professional photographers now sitting in front of me to do the job for me instead.
Well, thank you. I will try to find that.
That's what I don't know. That's why I'm saying if someone has the patience.
It was her 95th birthday?
I was there, and we gave her roses.
What Lynn is saying for the microphone is on her 95th birthday, friends of Florence brought red roses to her and had a birthday cake for her.
Powers, who passed away, we had her funeral yesterday. He gave the party for all of us.
John Powers and Lynn McLean were there and were always very kind to her. And it's John, I think, who worked to see that her house, in exchange for care for Florence, would happen. And there are some discs upstairs of the centennial discs where John speaks a little bit about Florence.
Well, if that was her 95th birthday, it should be, if it was on the occasion of her 95th birthday, that should cut down the research time, just find out what year she became 95.
That's right. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. And now, as you heard, across the street, the Hosmer House will be open so that you can look at her art, and there will be refreshments. And for people who have difficulty walking, you can drive right into the driveway and down behind where the shed is, so that it's a simple matter to get into the house. And I thank you again for opening the Hosmer House.
just one minute before you stand up, please. Lynn McLean would like to say something.
Helen, I have a little gift for her. She is such a delight to work with. We've had such fun.
We have.
We really have. We have both learned a lot.
Yes.
And it's a little token of our appreciation.
Thank you. I can't wait to see this, so you all get to share what it is. And I must say that upstairs on the second floor, while I was over in the house, Adolph and Lynn and I had the pleasure of opening a box with a lovely black garment that belonged to Florence that is upstairs now on a mannequin. Thank you. A palette. Doesn't that seem appropriate? Thank you. Thank you. I will treasure that, Lynn. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. There are books, there are note cards. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I love to do it.